Okay, everyone, welcome very much to this webinar. We are with Lynsey, Chutel, Tessa Dooms. Lynsey, of course, a journalist with the New York Times and has been with a number of other publications before, a multi-media journalist. Tessa Dooms, sociologist, political commentator, and development practitioner. The two of them have done what I regard as a very brave thing. They wrote a book and they called it Colored. Woo! You walk right into that. Yeah. So, I mean, it's a hell of a thing, you know. I mean, I am immensely impressed by what you have done, because in my own analysis, I'm reading this book and I'm thinking, yeah, I know that, I know that, I know that. So, and then you actually get to other stuff, which I'm like, wow, really? And you know, so you opening my eyes to aspects which I was not aware of: identity politics, historical lessons, personal lessons, especially. You know, I mean, I'm a sucker for good narrative and great social forensic anthropology. So for me, that was incredible. So I mean, kudos to both of you. You did a fantastic job there. For me, the great thing is that it's everything, like from I don't know who I am, you know, explanation. Like you start with that and you take it through the stages to a greater depth with layers built into that. And I really appreciated that. So I think it's a book that speaks to everybody. Although you make quite clear who you write this book for, maybe you guys just want to start off by chatting about that. Can we start with let's start with you, Tessa. Who's this book for?
The book is for colored people, and we say that very intentionally because I think you know, a lot of times when colored identity is discussed, it's colored or it's about explaining coloredness to the rest of the world, and so there's not very many opportunities where colored identity is written in a way to elicit a conversation amongst colored people. So, you know, in the way that we write the book, we do it intentionally through the stories that we all know, you know, through stories that are recognizable to people who are in colored communities, because it's also a homage to the call for representation. And, you know, being able to see ourselves in the society and particularly in the political discourse of the society. But it's also for people who have continuously asked the question to colored people, what are you? It's particularly for those people because firstly, it's a call to those people to stop asking, what are you? And to rather ask, who are you when it comes to colored people? And so it is a way to bring a broader dimension to coloredness for people who are outside of the colored community who keep asking that question. There's clearly still an interest in the lives of colored people. Some, you know, for some people, there's an erasure and an interest in people, you know, pulling people away from the identity. And other people, it's a fascination. But either way, we still get asked the question, what are you? And we wanted to answer that in a more humane way and a more multidimensional way so that people can see that there are lives behind this classification, as complicated as it is. So it's for colored people, but it's also about colored people for those who still look at the community either, you know, with questions or with concern.
Okay, you touched on something there that I was going to come to later, but to jump right ahead into this, you have a story there, and the great thing about this book is it's told through the experiences, the lived experiences, oftentimes of real people, you know, which I found quite fascinating. One of the people you mentioned is a lady, her surname is Burgess. And she's asked the question, you know, in a room full of, I think it's Xhosa speaking men, I think. What are you? I think it was the question. You know, and it's a reference to what are you? How do you essentially define yourself? What is your culture? And that is quite interesting for me, because that feeling, and I think a lot of people can identify with that. And I'm just setting it up here. I don't want to tell people what, and I think you guys can take it further from here. Maybe you want to speak to what her reaction was, because I really think a lot of people identify with the way she was left to feel and what her reaction was. Lynsey?
Yeah, you need to remind me exactly about what she said, but I remember that incident.
Okay, so what she says is, she felt like she was nothing. She was so confused. She was essentially like made to feel so small, like you are I think one of the most infamous things that the infamous line, and to paraphrase Marieke de Klerk, julle is 'n nie mens. And it was similar to that. It was, to my mind, when I read this, I thought, this sounds like Marieke de Klerk. So I don't know, you want to talk about that a little bit? And then she goes on in terms of her response, in terms of how she then goes on a journey herself. So let's just talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, and she's now a leader in the First Nations, and her journey has taken her to being a leader in the First Nations movement. But I think what is interesting for me in particular was, and we were quite deliberate in how we told the stories. Like, we know there's no shortage of academic work on colored identity and colored politics. But what we wanted to do was for people to be able to see themselves, and to take this as a sort of like a narrative journalism project, where you're taking individuals, the sort of everyday ordinary person, and telling their stories. And what was so fascinating about that particular approach was, we got to hear people's stories, and they spoke, these grand narratives, but they spoke it in such a simple way. This incredible sense of pain and loss that people had experienced. Like, there's one particular story of, I'll talk about Ruth Thomas, or she was Ruth Badal at the time. And she talks about how her grandmother was a Zulu woman, tried to hold on to them because the social worker was going to take them away because their father was Indian and they were now orphans. And how the grandmother wrapped them up in bandages because she didn't want people to see her Indian features. And so that, but she says it, I've always known this about Auntie Ruth. I've always known this, she's just like, well, that's just how it was, right? And so, but then when we sat down, and we truly sat down with the extent of the narratives that we'd collected, what we realized was that there was a real sense of pain, a real sense of loss, and a sense, in the same way that Burgess talks about having to find yourself. And some people don't go on that journey of finding themselves. Some people just kind of accept the sort of like social orphanhood, where they were simply, this is where they were. Like, to be colored was to not be enough. To be colored was to kind of like live in this nexus of nothingness, as Marieke de Klerk would go. It was just this idea that you were not black enough, or you're not white enough, and so therefore you were nothing. And I think particularly in a country that has turned sort of ethnic symbols into such national symbols, and sort of like built itself around this Rainbow Nation narrative, when you start asking, when you begin to have those conversations, particularly, and you see it's most starkly on Heritage Day, when you ask yourself, well, where do I fit in? And I think that's been the question that we wanted to answer for people in the simplest way. Like, we can sit there and have a conversation about miscegenation, and we do go into the history of the word, but I think what was most important for us was just the individual narratives, and to make this as accessible as possible as a story. I think storytelling is very important.
Let me take us back a little bit to the beginning, to the idea of colored. Tessa, you speak about addressing a room in the US and you use the C word. I laugh so loud. I mean, the idea, you use the word colored in the US, which of course is seen as a derogatory term to many black people in the US. They absolutely, like, they completely disassociate with that term. But you guys, I mean, you delve into the historical narrative around, the definition of the term colored to define a group of people. Of course, it became formalized under apartheid, but talk to us about that.
Yeah, I mean, the story that I tell about going to Atlanta, Georgia, and saying the word colored very casually, because I was a researcher at the time. I was just talking through the statistics. I wasn't even in the heart of the discussion yet, we're just doing demographics. And I mean, I of course, having consumed US culture for a while, of course, I knew about the word colored and its use in the US. I don't think I knew what it would feel like to say the word. And I think that that's one of the things we've discovered on this journey, that colored evokes emotion. the word evokes emotion. When I was standing in that room and people actually felt some level of, like disrespect almost at the use of a word that for me defines me. That was one of those things that we journeyed with. And even here in South Africa, journeying with that word intergenerationally, particularly has struck us. So people of our parents' generation and our grandparents' generation, the word colored has this history of, slavery, and it's got this history of, the colonial disruption. Then it's got this history of the imposition of the classification with apartheid. And so it's a word of harm and injury. It's a word that for many people was like a sledgehammer to their identity that was trying to either erase or break. And for me, as somebody who grew up in a somewhat constructed colored community already, by the time I'm born in the 80s and now my nieces and nephews in the 2000s, we don't have the same relationship with the word. And so when I tell the story, for example, of my father and how he came to have, the term colored as his classification, I realized a few things. So the story is that at the age of 16, he went into a registration office, taken from school. He had grown up in a Motswana village and a Motswana community and held the name Lesole, a Motswana name. And so presented himself in that clerk's registration office as he was classified as native Motswana, went home and discovered there was an entire politics around, deciding whether to classify as colored or black, that colored families were going through. And because our family had this kind of immediate, almost, 1 or 2 generations away, mixed heritage of a German white, European man and a Motswana woman, they were actually having to wrestle with what the best decision was politically for the family. And my father got caught up in that. He had to be taken back to the registration office, presented with an English name, so that he could then be classified as colored. And I mean, it teaches 2 things about it. One is that the idea that colored is about biology is a myth. It's untrue. Otherwise, it would have just taken him showing up and people looking at his body and deciding who he is. Even at that registration point, it was looking at language and, names and, cultural references to determine coloredness. And the fact that he then had to go and exchange his Tswana name for an English name, and he lost his Tswana name in the process, speaks about just how deeply violent that classification system was. And on the other hand, there's also this, I think the unspoken work that colored communities did when they were thrown together by the Group Areas Act. Really, literally, people are just pieced together. My father ended up in El Dorado Park in a colored community, a burgeoning colored community at that point, because he was arrested for working in his aunt's shop, Didn't go there by choice. He didn't say, oh, I just would love to be colored, let's go there. No, people are being put in to these communities that are now newly formed and having to make life. And I just wanted to also, for that previous generation, although the word has so much damage that it's done, I wanted them to realize that they've also made something of it. And that our generations that are now claiming and reclaiming the word are not reclaiming what the apartheid Verwoerd government did. We are reclaiming the beauty and the joy and the life and the complexity of the culture that they created despite that pain.
No, I mean, this is something that's I think is so topical and it's so critical right now, and it's obviously some people don't wholly agree with that. Some people will still say like, no, but we must reject this. It's so-called colored because and I mean, I personally feel obviously people should be able to identify as they choose. Unless you what's that, the Rachel Dolezal person who decide, the white woman who decided she's black. But otherwise, and I make a joke about it, but seriously though, I mean, yeah. And so you also, and sorry to stay with you, Tessa, but you made the point of, and this is not groundbreaking, but I think that it's important that many people, who identify culturally as colored also identify as Black.
Yeah,
Yes.
I mean, Lynsey and I both share that description of ourselves, where we identify as politically Black and culturally colored. And I actually am going to throw this one to Lynsey, because I think she makes the point about Black consciousness. Because I mean, we've spoken to a lot of activists, particularly from the UDF days. And a few weeks ago, Trevor Manuel cornered me and said, Black consciousness has helped us move beyond these terms of yours. But the reason why that was the
people have
conversation.
opinions. We must allow them that.
Absolutely. But the reason why I identify as politically Black and culturally colored is the same reason why somebody can identify as both Xhosa and Black, or Pedi and Black, because Blackness is about an identity that speaks to our positioning in society, and the ways in which racism and endemic forms of oppression have created these divisions based on phenotype, so that whiteness had somebody to oppress. And so as the BC crowd taught us, they said, Steve Biko is very emphatic when he says you must claim your Blackness as in solidarity with other oppressed people. You must understand that when you say you are Black, you are highlighting racism. You are highlighting the fact that there is this creation and invention of white supremacy, and we must be able to name it, and name the fact that the world has been set up with this false idea that just because we look a particular way, we are lesser than. And so when we say we are Black, we are leaning into the idea that we must be in solidarity with all oppressed people around the world who are impacted by racism. At the same time, though, the way we live and the way we show up has gone beyond what racism has done to us. And so, we've created culture. I mean, I've been thinking about the Shaka Lembede series that's been on, looking at Zulu history. And if you just look at the complex nature of the coming together of what is now thought of as a cohesive Zulu nation, yes, it was partly about the disruption of colonialism that brought together, a Zulu nation. But it was also a lot of internal work that people were doing, internal struggle that people were going through, and the creation of culture that was also bringing people together. And I think sometimes when we talk too much about the classification, and that's why the book subtitle is How Classification Became Culture. When we talk so much about the classification, we fixate on the power of the colonizer, the enslaver, the oppressor, the apartheid regime to tell us who we are. And we blind ourselves to our own agency. We blind ourselves to our own ability to have created life and created ways of showing up and created language, especially in the form of Afrikaans, where we were responding to the pain of all of this with things that were actually productive. And so I ask people to hold grace for each other. Let's start talking with a lot more grace, that I can accept the pain that the word has brought you, but I'm asking you also to accept the meaning that it has brought to me, and to not give Verwoerd more power than he needs, but to give me the agency to reclaim who I am on my own terms, even with a bad word.
Reminds me a lot about, you're reminding me a lot of Karima Brown right now. She often spoke to me about the agency of the oppressed, and she we're talking about, yes, but this, and she says, no, we have agency in what we do and what we say. Lynsey, sorry, I wanted to come to you also on the same issue here, just in terms of how you identify and how it is able to, are you able, I mean, but Tessa spoke to this, but I mean, I'm sure you also have your more nuanced view on that.
I think for me, I grew up in a Black consciousness family. My family's from KwaZulu-Natal, and our family very much straddles cultural identity as being Zulu and colored, because my great-grandmother, the matriarch of our family, is a Zulu woman, and so my family speaks Zulu. We understand the customs and culture, but we also don't, but we still very much identify as colored. And so for us, and also, we grew up in the bubble of being in a rural area. And I think there's two things there. One is that there's a lesson that there's no one way to be colored, because we were, we only when my family began to move out of rural northern KwaZulu-Natal did we come to Johannesburg, and you're suddenly now faced with the idea that you have to pick a side and you have to tick a box. And it's been a difficult experience for a lot of people who come from small towns, who speak Xhosa from the Eastern Cape or speak Zulu. And this demand, particularly if you're in an office space, in my case, in the newsroom, there you sort of asked to pick a side. Who are you? Who do you tick? Who do you not? And so I think the lesson that comes from Black consciousness is the idea that we do have a shared oppression, that, you know, we're fighting over the crumbs of apartheid. And I think one of the things that particularly stands out for me was when Cheryl Carolus, and as a student activist, and she and other young activists are traveling around the rural Western Cape, and they're going to Afrikaans-speaking towns, and they're going at a time just after the 76 riots, when Afrikaans is very much the language of the oppressor. And they've got to reckon with the idea that they're now going to go and mobilize and activate communities in the language of the oppressor. But you can't do it in any other language, because this is also very much the language of these people. And so being colored also means living with that sense of duality, because I think what the toughest thing to sort of accept at first about being colored is that it's an identity created by enslavement, by colonialism, by exploitation. One of the first instances of the word I found was with Cecil John Rhodes, when he was looking for cheap labor. And he said, you know, the natives might be too obstreperous, but the coloreds, and this was that combination of the formerly enslaved, the so-called freed blacks, the San and the Khoi who were at the Cape Colony at the time, who had kind of just tried to make the best of a community. And he looked at them and said, well, those people don't have a culture, so they'll be easier and they won't be able to mobilize. And so when we come and so for colored people to take that identity, like a difficult identity, Black consciousness helps us move forward and to say that ours is not, we are not alone here. And I think it really played out for me, and there was a reminder of the need for that with the Nathaniel Julius killing, when young people in Aldos felt that they were alone. And that's why that hashtag Colored Lives Matter, as opposed to Black Lives Matter, came up, because they felt that they had been forgotten. They felt that they'd been left behind by the Democratic Project. And what was so fascinating to me, because if you know Joburg geography, so Aldos is right next to Pimville, and we all meet in Kliptown, which is a so-called multiracial community. It's where colored people
was first.
What's that?
Kliptown was first.
Kliptown was first, exactly. We all come from this was so fascinating about that little corner, because I come from that Union Road section. And so Kliptown was first, and we all kind of broke off into Pimville, Shawela, and Aldos, right? We were separated, but we were separated by a street and a golf course. And what's so fascinating is that even though that distance is geographically so short, psychologically and socioeconomically, it seems so far. And yet socioeconomically, it's not that different, because the streets are not that much wider in Aldos. And the social systems are not much better. The toilets were not, maybe in some houses the toilets were inside as opposed to outside, and the blocks were slightly better of your council house. But what we've allowed is that we've allowed for those tiny material differences that apartheid gave us to separate us from a shared experience of oppression. And I think that's the tragedy and the victory of apartheid. And if you continue to do that, if you continue to see your struggle as a struggle of only you and your people, if you continue to separate yourself from the greater South African struggle and the greater need to rebuild the country, then we are in trouble. And I think that's where Black consciousness helps us. We can look back. But then I think where Black consciousness falls short is that, and it's not Black consciousness's fault, it came afterward, we grow and we evolve, is that intersectionality comes into play. Because Black consciousness didn't really have a lot of space for things like gender and different cultural expressions. And so now that we've gotten freedom, how do you build freedom? Now that we've gotten sort of political freedom, how do you build that freedom? And it's not enough to just plaster over people's identities, because we now fully understand how important identity is to people as we move through the world. And so I think a sort of combination of intersectionality, to recognize that I am a woman and an African and a Black woman and a colored woman, all of those things, a journalist, whatever I am today, if we make space for that, I think we go a lot further and we begin to rebuild the country.
So you touched on a number of things there. I asked a very specific question, but and I thank you for it, because it allows me segues to so many other questions that I do have. But let's to make it simple. You say that this book was informed with the killing of Nathaniel Julius, and the question that was rather the questions that came up as a result of that. So Lynsey, just take us into that, please. Like, I mean, you a journalist, you have been a journalist for more than how long has it been now? 15 years. I don't want to give away your age, but that doesn't matter. Anyway, but the point is, like, you're an experienced journalist. You've done really great stuff. Yeah, you get published around the world. And what you say matters. And so Nathaniel Julius gets killed. And you watching this, right? This is from your hood. This is home now. So what are the conversations that are going between you and Tessa, or with you, between you and other people in your community, in terms of how you're seeing this reflected in the media?
I mean, so I watched the murder, or I watched the fallout from away from Aldos. I was in the Eastern Cape at the time. A world away, it seemed like it. But then the news, and we didn't have TV, and the news kept coming. And so that's how you know it was impossible to get away from it. And then I started getting messages from people, are you okay? But then the real message comes when an editor calls, because I was a freelancer at the time. And the editor at the New York Times calls and says, well, there's been a police killing. And that had been 2020, the summer of police killings. And she says, but the hashtag is different. It's not Black Lives Matter. It's color, but she can't say it because she's American. So she stumbles, but she goes, I said, it's colored. You can say it. Yeah. She says, yeah. I said, why are people still, why is this word? I said, I identify as colored, and we still use the word. And the police killing is not unlike the killings in the United States. But I think the flame that lights it is when the president comes in and characterizes it as gang violence. And I found that personally insulting. It's like, when he said, the reason we have this level of violence in these communities is because gangs are allowed to continue to proliferate. And I thought, the reason you have gangs, if at all, is because young people don't have opportunities and they don't have jobs. And you saw that anger. There was one image of I think someone was jumping over a barbed wire to get to the police station. And that tells you the level of frustration young people had with silver spoons, what we call the police station. The level of frustration and the anger of having to go there, because the police station in Aldos is also very much a meeting point, right? It's where you go get your affidavit. That line is always full outside the police station. There's a lot of activity, community activity, the work's happening at that police station. But it's also a very adversarial place because people feel like they go there and nothing happens. They've changed out the whole staff of that police station. And so it was an opportunity to discuss all of these issues. And then at the same time, so I have to now come out of my holiday in the Eastern Cape because Tessa also phones me. And then she had been, and I'll throw this back to her, how we got here was, Tessa, you take it from me and how you ended up calling me and how our sort of jobs met at this point.
Yeah, so I was doing political analysis as I do, and so I get called to comment on this what was turning out to be big political story around Nathaniel Julius' murder. And I found myself having extremely emotional conversations on the radio and the TV, because besides the fact that it's also my hometown, I just got annoyed at people asking why are colored people angry. I'm just like, isn't it obvious? Firstly, they're in South Africa. We are here. We are in South Africa, and everyone is, angry at different levels. But also, I then understood the ways in which colored communities are disappeared from the national story. And I think the underlying thing that I started realizing was going on in terms of people asking, why are people still using the word? Why are people angry? Why do people feel like they've been done in the service? Is that particularly from other Black communities, there's still this lingering idea that colored people have it better. And so there's legitimacy in that in terms of the apartheid moment, particularly, where that stratification is put in place and, people are almost opting into coloredness to have a little bit of a better life. But that was never a bona fide, better. The better always had a caveat. The better came with all of these other frustrations and pain. And in the post-democratic moment, the post-94 moment, colored communities have not been treated any better than any other communities that are low-income townships, rural areas. Colored people have suffered under that because really what we did with the apartheid project is we never ended apartheid. We just gave it a much sharper economic slant so that there could be Black people who could also be, you know, part of the elite. But, you know, the communities that are in townships are equally given bad treatment. And so to assume that colored people today have some sort of benefit and shouldn't be, you know, angry, it's a misunderstanding. But it helped me understand that people didn't understand the experience of being colored. And again, that brought us back to why we wrote this book as a narrative of experiences. So you start to break through some of those notions. So I called Lynsey because I was afraid to write alone. Jonathan Wall gave me a call in the midst of all of that and said, hey, do you want to write something about all of these emotional conversations you've been having? And I said yes, because I understood the task, but I said not alone because I didn't trust myself. And I think it was better for us to write it together because it did give us a much greater sense of range, and we could have a deeper conversation, I thought. But yeah, that in that moment, Lynsey also covered the story, the Nathaniel Julie's trial, beyond that moment. So I think we really, it was better together, for lack of a better phrase.
Better together. You're watching too much rugby, Tessa.
I know. I've just lamented it.
Hey, next thing you're going to be preaching rainbowism. Okay, so where I want to go now, guys, there's so much to talk about but where I wanted to go here is the experience of writing this book, right? You're talking about your people here. I'm not talking about, you know, the large idea of being colored. You're talking about your community here, people you live with. This is extremely intimate. I mean, you know, I mean, for me personally, the thing that I avoid, I don't write about myself or my neighborhood or the people. At first, it was because of other things, but you know, because it's just so, you know, like bearing your soul kind of stuff. You know, it's really scary. How do you approach that? You know, because I mean, as journalists, sociologists, you guys do something similar. You have subjects, you're writing a research paper, you're writing something for the newspaper. You have people, you are dissociated, you know, you are trying to get the information from them, but you already have ideas about this because this is you. You're talking about yourself, aren't you? How do you go about doing that? And you know, I mean, I imagine that there would be some aspiring young journalists on this call with us. And why would they want to do that, you know, to themselves?
I'm going to let the journalist have this conversation first.
You don't get away from this either, Tessa, but Lynsey, let's kick off with you.
Sure. I mean, I'll throw the sociologist under the bus in a second. But I think that, you know, it was not an easy task, and particularly because how we're trained as journalists. We've done away with the notion of objectivity. We know it doesn't exist. But we also try very hard to make sure that everybody gets a voice. And so I think at first I hid behind that. I hid behind history and what we call B matter in the story, you know, how we got here. And so I did a lot of historical digging. I read all the books, I did the stuff, you know, because that's how you tick boxes, even academically. I wanted to show some sort of rigor. But then at the same time, and then we started talking to people. And it started with the Nathaniel Julie's thing, and I knew it had gotten bigger than just the news article because of the emotions in the courtroom. And so as a journalist, that's an easier enough approach. You know, it's a common approach. And to sit with that grief and this terrible story and the impact. But then and then we thought, okay, we'll start talking to people who represent, because what happens is that you have, you know, in any decent journalistic story, you have character. And then we'd go through the history, we'd go through the facts, we'd go through the stats, and then like, oh, well, who is the character? And then you find out that the character is someone that you know. And it was then in starting to talking to people and taking out little moments of our lives. So, and some people were open about it, you know, they wanted to share their stories. For example, like Auntie Ruth, I went to talk to her about her husband who spoke every language, because his funeral truly was a very moving thing. And she said, but you haven't asked me about my story. And then I got to talking about her. And then theirs became, you know, this, you know, their love story becomes the platform to talk about the role of language in the colored community and how we've been taken away from it and often. And of course, food is an easy one, right? I was worried about whose recipes am I going to leave out and what am I going to keep. But it was in talking about and I'm sure anyone can tell the writing of the hair and skin chapter, because that one feels labored to me, was to write about myself and write about my own family's experiences, and how those little jokes that we tell ourselves and those little things that we say and those little nicknames we have carry a lot of history and a lot of pain in them. So there's, in every colored community, I don't know about down in the Cape, but up here in particular, there's always a Boera, right? And so, because Boera is the light cousin, and so everybody, that's his nickname, and there's almost a sense of pride in the fact that Boera's got light hair and green eyes, and at the same time, people who look like me without krusse hair and our darker skin have a very different experience of what it means to be colored. And this is one of the things that I spoke to Tessa about, and I said, I really had to do some excavation, was personal excavation. I said, well, people are going to say to me, I don't have a right to speak because of the way I look and because my heritage is so mixed and then it came down to accepting that I did in fact have the right to talk about this, because my experience was also valid, was as valid as the people who I was asking. And then the reality is that if I'm going to ask other people to be as vulnerable as they were, that I had to also show up. And so the first draft didn't have much of us at all, didn't have me in particular. I was not there. But the second draft
trained well.
yeah, it went there. And it was just, I suppose, I don't know if journalism would benefit a little more from acknowledging our own roles in a story. But I think when something was happening so close to the bone, it was impossible not to write about myself and my own family. And then I guess also I'm lucky that my grandmother's 95 and has a memory like you will not believe. So I kept having to ask her the same question over and over as to how we got to Northern KZN. And it was in the last interview. So by this time we'd had like 3 or 4 interviews. Sometimes I'm like tricking her. She knows I'm recording, and then she shuts down. And then I have to like get her to calm down again and chat. And eventually I learned that, and she says it in a whisper. She says, ons was slava, we were slaves. And that's how the family, they ran away. And for the first time in the writing of this book, toward the last bits of the draft, I learned that my family ran away from the Boers in the Great Trek and ended up in Northern KZN. Wow. And that's like, and so now it's our family history. So there was value in excavating your own story. Tessa?
Yeah, so the reason why Lynsey was forced to write herself in is because my then 16-year-old niece got to read a few chapters, and she's an aspiring writer. And her main feedback was, why don't you talk about yourselves more? Where's your voice? She literally asked, where's your own voice? And besides the fact that I'm hella proud that she was smart enough to know to ask that, it did force us to really, speak in our own voices a lot more and to be our souls a lot more. And, Lynsey says at one point in the book, read this book with your head and your heart, because we really had to write it with our heads and our hearts. And if I would say anything to journalists, which I have no business really saying, but here we are. I mean, trained as a researcher, when I used to teach, third year students, particularly research, the one thing that I often say to them is that to be reflexive and honest is more important than to be right. It's more important that the audience hears that you are not pretending to not exist, that you are not pretending that you can be fully objective. You're not pretending. You're being honest. And if you're wrong, people will tell you that. They'll point it out to you, but you're participating in a human conversation. And all of your history comes with you when you write. Your history just doesn't stay behind. It comes with you. And it's better for the reader to know who they're in conversation with than to be, talking to a blank piece of paper that's pretending, that it doesn't have anybody behind it. And I think I've taken the same approach to reading theory. I always, said to my students, if you want to know the heart of a theory, research the background of the theorist. Know who Karl Marx was when he was writing. And that then helps you understand better, why some things, seem like they resonate more and others, resonate less. So I came into this very willing to do that kind of work, to rather just say this is who I am. And in the broader perspective of my work, doing political commentary, I felt like this is one part of my identity I had not actually brought to my work. So people kind of have a sense that I'm left-leaning, have a sense that I'm pro-democracy, all of those things. But having a sense that I'm colored, and I'm colored on purpose, has not come through my work very strongly. And I wanted it to come through because I think it's as important to who I am and how I show up. Being working class colored, being from Aldos. I mean, there's the one part of being colored and, having made it in the world. People are like, oh, you made it. The one part of it is, people saying to you, oh, you've left your roots behind, or, stuff like that. The other part is people kind of erasing your roots. And, now you're evolved beyond your community. You've risen above the community, and this being some kind of celebratory thing. And I think part of this is also about holding myself accountable to this is the community that raised me. I dare not move on with my life without this community. I dare not try to write this community out of my story. And so I would challenge journalists to think about themselves in that way as well, that you are bringing yourself to the stories, but you're also, telling the world who you are as you write so that they have a better context as they read.
One thing that we haven't touched on in this conversation is what makes you colored. So, I'm from, like they say, I suppose I'm from the Cape. I never regarded Bellville as the Cape, but anyway, the Cape Province, let's call it that way. Yeah. So, and there's commonalities, even between me who grows up in that part of the world, which is where we speak Afrikaans. The people who live closer to the mountain, they speak English. There's differences between us, there's also in terms of culture, because my people come from what they call die land, Karoo and so forth, Boland and so forth. So similarly, I come up to Joburg, and I can see quite starkly the differences in culture between myself and other colored people. So what is that commonality though, that makes you colored, that makes you say, like, I identify as colored? Is there that kind of, okay, you need to tick these boxes? You must have a GHD. You must have, all of the, I don't know, what is it?
You must at least know what a GHD is.
Yeah. Do you know where to go and find, and then we'll have words about this, Lynsey. Cook sisters, not cook sister. So we have these things, but I mean, what, and you guys talk about this in the most, and in an emotive way. And this is also, and I mean, especially when it comes to Black women, hair, hair is so critical in terms of our identity. So, and I separately want to talk about the language issue, about Afrikaans. But I mean, can we talk about those other commonalities, the food, the hair, the everything?
I'll start with you. You have to start this one.
I mean, do you know, if you don't understand the value of a yellow roller versus a pink roller, does that make you any less colored, is the question that we need to ask. But no, I think, what we did find is, and particularly, so my family is, as I said, from KZN, so our experience is entirely different, right? But then it's also KZN small town versus KZN big city, because Durban, like Wentworth and Newlands and Eastwood, Maritzburg, that's an entirely different set of rules. And for example, there's no Afrikaans. Not a thing, not happening, ain't gonna happen, there's a block, right? But that doesn't make people from KZN any less colored, because I think the things, and then there's people from, for example, I was talking to my uncle Eddie, who's not really my uncle, but I call him my uncle, that's another thing, everyone's your uncle, right?
That's another box tick for you there.
There's a box. From Sishefo, right? And their perspective is again entirely different, right? It's more Sepedi, it's more rooted in what their version of the land is. So I think what's important is, we want people to walk away with there's no single way of being colored. There are multiple ways where this identity comes through. And there are ways, for example, in which what we, as Tessa said earlier, this is a community that was thrown together because of the Group Areas Act. And it was thrown together and forced to make a community and to make something of itself. It was a community of people from as early as the Cape Colony that were pushed together and forced together. And so therefore and in that oppression, they created some sort of commonalities, right? But then I think there are also things that our oppression, we've also created, has born some creativity. And I think it's in the similarity in the way that we spice our food, for example, even though I had never had bobote in my life before. I know exactly when I'm eating a smochi from a colored auntie, because the similarity in the spices is there. And the similarity is there because of, we forget that there was a lot of migration between communities even before that, even despite the Group Areas Act, people moved up and down. And so I think there are those tick boxes, like, for example, Cook Sisters. I don't know when they came up, and I don't know when, for example, the Gatsby came up, because in Joburg we call it the AK. But it's the same food, and we know exactly what it is. And I think what we've done, we've done so much work as kind of people trying to separate ourselves, right? Like, oh, I don't want to be. And it's not just Cape and KZN or Cape and Gauteng. It's I don't want to be Sydenham and Wentworth. I know I'm better than Sydenham is better than Wentworth. Bosmont is better than Noordgesig. And so what we do is we then perpetuate these differences between ourselves instead of finding sort of a commonality between ourselves. And I think we'll find that in a far more striking way, just, in terms of connection. Tessa?
Yeah, so, I mean, starting point, there's no one way of being colored, right? What I've been surprised by, even in just writing this book, is that we don't give each other enough credit for the cultural exchange we did in the making of these, Mengelmoes communities, right? So there are people in Cape Town who, by God, swear that they are no Cook Sisters in Joburg. And it's because we don't say Cook Sister. So you think we're talking about the stroop cookie thing. We're not. We just have a different dialect for the same thing. But that thing was transported by somebody. I can tell you, probably my Aunt Lali, who was raised in Cape Town and married in Eldos. I tell you, she was making Cook Sisters, on that basis. And so there's a lot of cultural exchange that we've done. Music is probably one of the biggest cultural exchanges that we've done, right? And the music actually doesn't just talk about, colored identity in South Africa, but also Creole identity across the world. You see, like, with, African-American experiences in America, Caribbean experiences. At our launch, there is a woman from the Caribbean who said, I've been in South Africa, and the closest I've had to a cultural experience I identify with is colored communities. Because there's something about having created forced communities on the basis of slavery and colonialism that's created some sort of similarities in the way we show up. And I always thought that our weird fixation with African-American culture that colored communities have had. I mean, in the 90s, we were somewhere between hip hop and, the waves in our hair and Kirk Franklin's music. And I was just like, we've got a weird obsession. But I think it's because we both have that shared experience as communities of having to make it up. And we were kind of, there's kind of a meeting of souls there that says, we're all having to figure this out together. And so I think we don't give ourselves enough credit for having done that work. But there are beautiful things that we share, and there are beautiful, like, sensibilities that we have. So in the book, I speak about Zasha Zacchaeus, who is born in Bloemhof and then moved to Eldos. She's a jazz singer. And if you know anything about jazz, it's got that, deep history of coming from the slave communities as well, of the North Americas, but finding resonance in colored communities. So two stories about that. One is that I listened to Zasha when she was starting to promote her album, Therapy. And I hadn't heard the album before. I heard her live. And so she's singing this song, and it's a beautiful song, and I'm listening to it. And she gets to the chorus, and it's simply the best. But this song sounded like Sunday Morning in Eldos. But it was actually Tina Turner, Simply the Best, with that sound. And I don't know how to explain to anyone what Sunday Morning in Eldos sounds like. But if you were in a colored community, you know exactly what I mean. And so there is a sound and a smell and a texture and a feel, and we can see each other from afar because we've created something, and it's not one thing. And that's why I say when classification became culture, not a culture, it's culture in a broad, fluid sense. But on the other hand of that, I was in New York a few months ago, and I go to Brooklyn, and while I'm in there, I start seeing two people start to jazz. And I'm just like, I know what you're doing. You're jazzing. I get involved in the jazz, and they're also like, what are you doing? Why do you know to do this? But we've done something here, guys. We've created something, and we've created, whether we've borrowed and exchanged and made up, we've created things, and we've created a life, and we've created a recognizable sense of self, and we should be proud of that, and not be so harsh on ourselves because we can't tick one list comprehensively. It's not a test that you can pass or fail. But the last thing I'll say about this, because it does come up in chapter 3, where we speak about colored, Trevor Noah's coloredness or lack thereof, is that colored isn't just simply being mixed race. In fact, there are many people who hold the name colored who've never been mixed by anything in their ancestry, in any substantive way, especially Khoi and San communities. And so colored is about what the community shows up as, and having a sense of that community that identifies with coloredness, rather than some sort of biology test about your hair and complexion.
That's such a critical point, I believe. That's really, really, I think there's a couple of other things that I wanted to touch on. One of the things I wanted to speak about is, we don't have a lot of time, but I'm going to try to squeeze us in, and I'm going to ask you to be concise on this. One of the things that we can't avoid talking about, you guys spoke about it briefly, is the fact that you spoke about that not white enough, not black enough, but there's this active, and this is historical, and it still exists today, that wanting to, that clear separation from blackness. I don't want to be seen as black. I want to go and, people will, they'll try to do that physically, but in every other aspect, in the conversations that they have, to create this clear differentiator that I am not black. That obviously is very much a historical thing, which of course informs how we act today, and then in turn, something else that you guys also touched on is that historical kind of self-loathing and then loathing by other Black communities to say, like, they think that they're better than us. They've always been better than us, or think that they're better than us. Lynsey?
I think so. Particularly if you're dark-skinned with Crusade, I like to tease people and say that I remind you of the Black grandmother that you are avoiding, the one whose photo didn't make it to the war unit.
Lovely.
But I think more than that, and I understand, and I struggled with this, and this is why I didn't necessarily, I didn't shout from the rooftops that I was colored. I didn't deny it either, but I was not going to join a color solidarity movement, because I myself have experienced a lot of rejection from colored communities because of the way I look, and so have many people who look like me. But I think what this book has done, it's taught me just the full extent of internalized racism and why colored people make these decisions about not wanting to be seen as Black. When you were seen as Black, it took you away from your community. It meant, in the starkest terms, it meant economic advantage. And if you were caught as being Black and you were married to a colored woman, it also meant that your family was being ripped apart. And so in that extent, I can understand the fear of being identified as Black. I truly can. And the fear of having the meager advantages that you did have taken away from you. And then I can understand also how to say you're not Black also creates a sense of community, because you can never quite be Black. And this is the story of my family, where even though we understand the culture and the language, we can never be Zulu. And so maybe it comes out of a sense of anger to say that I can't be Zulu, I'm just never going to be Black. And there's a deep need for separation there. But I think that just as I have sort of gone on a journey of understanding what internalized racism means, for colored communities and why we hold on to it and why we can also let go. Because I've got to say, I think I've forgiven colored people quite a bit for the manner in which dark-skinned colored people have been treated. I think that we're beginning to have that conversation. As someone said to me in Stellenbosch, we revealed all the fail Onaroka. And I think now that the Onaroka are out on show, we can now begin to have a conversation about why these nicknames and why these legacies endure and why we are also scared of our hair getting wet. That's, yeah. So I'll throw it to Tessa.
I mean, I think the only thing that I'll add to that is that it's not as much the rejection of our blackness that I worry about, but our celebration of proximity to whiteness, that we're trying to be as white as possible.
Yeah.
And that for me concerns me more, because I think we must grapple with the fact that our value is not based on how close to white we are. And we've often said, as we've been talking about this book, this is about saying, it's not about not black enough or not white enough. It's about that we are enough as we are. And so this constant search for the approval of whiteness and white people must stop, must absolutely end if we're going to reclaim ourselves. And that's also the arc of the book, right? The arc of the book is my father having this white clerk take away his name. And then my father going back to his Tswana village and reclaiming his name on his own terms and saying, I am going to decide who I am now. I'm going to decide my value. I'm going to decide how I identify and how I show up and how I make meaning. And so again, we're not even asking people in this book to shout out, I am colored, and everybody must just accept the word colored and all of that. That's not what we're asking for. But like the Khoisan First Nation movement has done, to be able to say, you know what, we have this relationship to being colored, but we also have an entire heritage behind it that we want to reclaim. Or for young, colored people to be able to say, I want to reinvent what colored looks like and sounds like and feels like. I want to do something different here. And that's all we want, is for colored people to feel like we are enough as we are, and we are legitimate parts of the South African story as we are. And we don't have to wait for anyone else's approval anymore to take back the right to identify ourselves and show up in the society as fully as we can.
Now you say this, Tessa, and the truth that you speak, I hear this being same truth, and people are using it for different means. And I told you this was coming, Lynsey. You can sit this one out if you want. And they're doing it, and they coalescing around political parties. First as community movements. We saw this starting in Cape Town with your Gatfall guys who are, and I'll say this blatantly, they are racist, nationalist, xenophobes, denying black people their historical right to land. These are guys who read a quarter of the textbook and they thought they knew something, but they are obviously dim-witted. But you have those guys, and then you have someone like Gayton McKenzie and sidekick Kenny Konene trying similar tactics, maybe with a little bit more eloquence on occasion. And then and people are lapping this up because he's one of us. He's a man of the people. I was seeing Dalium Popo Walsh interviewing him, and when he got caught in the corner, it was like, oh no, you're too clever for me. You're coming with your big words. Yeah, okay. But so you're seeing people taking this idea, and I mean, we're living in a space where there's this lagerism, of course, happening all across the world, right? And there's this, what is my tribe, and yeah. So colored people as a marginalized ethnic minority, that is essentially, let's work from there. So you guys actually devote a chapter where you actually get into this proper. You want to talk about that a bit, Tessa?
Yeah. So just because I find it a very easy thing to say. Number one, you can celebrate yourself and your own uniqueness without rejecting anyone else. The last thing we need is more oppression Olympics in South Africa. Yes, there are many people and many groups that are being oppressed by the current set of circumstances and the current powers that be. And what we should not be doing is looking from Noordgesig across the road to Diepkloof and saying, okay, how much more oppressed are you than me? when actually the people at the union buildings is where all of our attention should go if we really want a better life. We've spent way too much time having battles of the oppressed, when actually we should have solidarity of the oppressed against those in power. And so for me, what it shows is two things. One, there's a dearth of leadership, just political leadership in general in the country, and there's a lack of representation in our politics. And so when you have 300 odd parties, it's because people just want to feel seen. And I'll tell you this about the Patriotic Alliance. I do not believe that people who are joining the PA are joining it because of Gayton's rhetoric around colored nationalism. They're joining it because Gayton shows up in their community and other politicians don't. Because people just want to feel seen, heard, and represented. And so we must start just, pandering to that need for political representation and a sense that somebody sees us and fights for us. Because where we are right now creates these voids and these vacuums. And people with the most debased sense of politics and who are opportunistic will take advantage of us because we have not had leaders who see us. So for me, it's a very simple answer. The Olympics, Oppression Olympics is not the way forward. Solidarity amongst oppressed people is the only way forward. And maybe the other part of it is around the Khoisan the San people. And I want to say this because it's come through in a few interviews. Firstly, when people from Khoisan San ancestry say that the blacks came later when they want to make claims to the land, it's such a misunderstanding of what it even means to be black, number one, but also about historical accuracy. You can't say that the Xhosa weren't there. How do you know that? So again, you don't have to say they weren't here in order to say that I was here. It's nonsensical. But also, again, blackness is about understanding that we have all suffered under the oppression of white supremacy, and it is our job to fight against it together rather than to fight for the crumbs.
Lynsey, you got anything to add to that?
This is where I'm not going to agree with Karima, and I'm not going to opine about politics as a journalist. Karima wore her party colors. I'm not. But I see we've got a question in the Q&A though.
Oh, we do. Must I refresh this thing? I don't see it though.
Yeah, I don't see it either.
I'll read it. So Monroe Williams asks, how does this conversation permeate educational institutions, specifically institutions of higher learning, when these very institutions still feel that the conversation of coloredness is contentious and many colored academics don't identify with the term and simultaneously distance themselves from colored communities? I think that kind of touches on everything we've spoken about,
Yeah, I mean...
please, Tessa, go ahead.
So, I mean, academics like Demetria Erasmus were... in my orbit of university education, who did speak about the term colored and did do a lot of the work around race and Black consciousness. But I think that what's been missing in the academic space has been the more contemporaneous stuff. So there's a lot more history than there is a contemporary conversation about navigating our identities. And I think that's where the educational institutions need to move us a little bit forward so that we don't understand, ethnicity and race only on the basis of history, but we start doing, more contemporary histories amongst ourselves. I think, 70 years, I was counting it, 70 years from the apartheid moment to now is a long time. 2 generations of people have created life after that moment. So our academics must start to reflect on that as well.
And I think what was really, what's been great about this book is we're learning as much as we've written. And so when we were in Stellenbosch this weekend, a number of students who are about our generation and younger were talking about the research that they're working on. And they're working on surveys, for example, do people identify as colored, and if so, why? And there was this really interesting conversation that happened in the moment where a woman who was born in the 70s and 60s, I'm just guessing her age here, was saying that to her, the term felt like a prison, where to him, who was born in the 80s and 90s, the word felt like a sense of place and a sense of home. So that I think that research is beginning to come about. There's a wonderful moment that we've sort of just kind of like stumbled into at this point. And then there was also research on, particularly on hair, because the conversation around hair is a global conversation about how people, particularly Black women, show up. And there's how Black women show up, and then within the colored community, how colorism plays out within our own communities as well. And just in terms of like why that value that was created by the apartheid system still endures. So I do think those young people younger academics are beginning to challenge that notion. And I mean, even the world so-called that phrase. I think they're beginning to challenge that, and I'm excited. So yeah.
I saw another question about the arts.
What role does the arts and artists play in communicating colored culture?
Yeah, I'm happy to take that one. I think it was 2 days ago we ended up sitting with Charles Ash, who started the website braino.com almost about 20 years ago now. And Charles has been a big advocate for representation and has done work with color TV, etc. And I think there's an evolutionary need there in that space where a lot of the artistic work, in the past has been stuck on the stereotypes. If you think about color representation on TV, it's the comedy shows with the lady in the rollers and the doek and the gown, or, even the comedy stuff, where we've been caught up in the stereotypes, the gangsterism, all of that. And again, Zasha Zacchius makes a really great point in the book where she says, now is the time for us to give colored young people the space to re-represent, and so when we had our Aldo's launch, we had a launch that was particularly in Aldo's with our community and Cook Sisters and Gatsby's. It was fantastic. One of the things we did was we had 2 young artists, a group, and then a young solo pianist, colored, and just bringing a whole different version of what it meant to be colored. I'd never heard Justin Bieber's songs sung in colored. It was fantastic. It really, really was fantastic. But I don't think it needs to be like an overt, here is colored. It's just about giving colored people space and legitimacy within the arts, and we'll show up in the ways we show up. The best example historically, I think of it, has actually been the hip hop space, where hip hop culture and within colored communities didn't try to scream we are colored as much as it just participated in the creation of hip hop in a way that was, organic and flowed. And it was beautiful to watch because it was part of a global story and a South African story. So for me, I think it's just about saying beyond the stereotypes, there's more to being colored, and the artists can show us the way forward.
Yeah.
I like that. I like that a lot. Yeah, like, I was, there's Afrikaans television, a lot more Afrikaans television on DSTV these days. And I remember a popular performer from the colored community who was in front of a white audience, and he was singing the song, which was quite popular back in the day, just a local thing, but it was quite derogatory. The song is Jou hare kan nie pompomi. So, it's for those who don't understand that, essentially what they're saying is they're making fun of a woman or a girl's hair, that you can't tie it up essentially in but what do you call these things? A scrunchie, right? Or something.
Ponytail.
Or ponytail, yeah. So now he's like, doing the thing, he's dancing, he's doing his thing, and the crowd starts joining in, the white crowd, and it's like, I just thought, wow, and I haven't watched the channel since. So
Yeah.
that's why I'm so enthused, right, by the fact that what you're talking about, Tessa, because yes, maybe you need a different generation to let us clear the stage. Clear the stage, let them tell a reinterpretation of their life, because these tropes are so antiquated and so boring, you need, and that's not the reality, and similarly, I'll take it beyond arts and culture. You speak to anybody who's in the sports, you speak to the guys who's part of the Springbok team now. God, every story must start off, yes, I had to dodge the gangsters, and guys, some of those places these guys come from, I know where they come from, and it's my part of the world, a lot of them, and there's not a lot of gangsters around. And that's the thing. The truth is, the gangster thing is overplayed, overstated in many instances, because it does not actually dictate the movements of much of what happens in day-to-day life. So thanks for that.
AKA is really also a great example of this, where AKA was entirely colored. Like, he was colored. He was very obviously colored. But AKA didn't have to like lean into every colored stereotype in order to show up, and we can be proud of AKA and, and the fact that he's colored without having to like, say, he could have been a gangster, but now he's just being a South African artist that created a genre of music and leaned into a genre of music that, wasn't specific to any particular group. That's a fantastic contribution that colored people can make. And I'll end off this part by talking about something I speak about in the book around the Kaapse Klopse. So doing some history into the Klopse, I discovered that there's a Guma version of Give Me Hope, Johanna, which is actually the origin of the song. And that song was about a little girl, a mixed girl, called Johanna, that they were saying Johanna gives us hope because she shows us that a united South Africa is possible. I mean, I didn't even know the Guma version was the original thing, but we've contributed to the narrative. That's great. I mean, sometimes it gets bastardized here and there, but it's okay. But I think we must just give ourselves, again, space and credit and not expect it to show up in particular ways. Because my greatest worry for young colored people particularly is that they keep on getting judged by their parents' pain. So it's like, oh my God, you're accepting this thing that caused me pain. Yes, but it was your pain. And you gave me something as an inheritance beyond your pain. And I'm now embracing the thing you gave me. I'm not embracing what Forwood gave you. I'm embracing the thing you gave me. So we must not hold young people hostage to the traumas of the past. We want to acknowledge those traumas, understand them, but they cannot be a present for the youth.
I think there's just a quick thing. There's a really, if you do want to see what young colored people are doing, there's a really interesting moment happening in jazz where, and I think Kyle Shepard started with South African History X, where Kyle Shepard, who was very much ordained as the new dollar brand Abdullah Ibrahim, and then Kyle does something wonderful in embracing Khoi and San heritage. And then just a few years later, that's how quickly the evolution came. Benjamin Jafta has created an album, Not Born, what is it? Not Born South African, Not Born Colored.
No, born colored, not born free.
Yes, and it's just, it grapples with his own journey, and it at the same time sounds, as we say, like a Sunday morning in the township. And I think it comes back to that thing that Toni Morrison says. Well, if you believe racists, and I'm paraphrasing, you spend half your time proving that you have a culture. And what Shepard does and what Jafta does, they're not proving that they have a right to be at the piano or to be at the double bass. They are simply being who they are. And I think we need to give young colored people that space to simply be who you are. Draw from all your histories, draw from all of who you are, and draw from Manenberg and draw from hip hop. But also be like Zasha says, not all colored music is Whitney Houston and Crystal. Crystal Waters, that's it. We need to move on a little bit. And I think to give them the space is so to go check out those people. I think they have offer a valuable lesson. Wow.
Guys, I want to end with one last question. You guys have been touring with a book. I could see in some of the spaces, which I had a peep into it, was very well received, some great engagement. But I think the one place that you went to probably went more than anything else when you took it back to Aldo's. How was it received? Did you do good?
The most common response to this book has been tears. Tears and tears and tears.
You see
and people feel seen. And that's the best validation I could have gotten for this project. We're getting a lot of flack from people who are like, have you read academic text X? Have you cited so-and-so? Did you draw on the... And I'm like, to the intellectuals, we love you. But the most common thing has been people saying, we feel seen, we feel heard. And also the other most common thing, especially in that Aldo's one, we spent at least a half an hour of people just telling their stories. No one asked us a question. People just kept telling their stories. And I think that this has been a release for people in just telling their stories. Probably my most profound moment wasn't from the Aldo's one. It was when I went to Wentworth, in the Wentworth community. And I end the music chapter with this song, Hey Owens, Colored. And, I didn't know how precious that song was to that community, but that song comes from that community. And in the audience was the wife of one of the people who wrote the song. And she just said, this means so much that you have seen our community, and our community is now memorialized in this book. And so that's been the joy of this book, has been people feeling seen and feeling free to tell the stories that they ordinarily would not tell, or tell around the Kombuis, stories. Now seeing it, taken to the world.
I think if there are any journalists on the line or on the call or any storytellers, I think that has been the biggest lesson for us, is that sometimes in South Africa, we get because the news cycle here is relentless, you forget to tell the stories, and you forget that the news is in fact about the stories. And so we run from politician to courtroom, and we forget that there are real people in between, and there are real people waiting for the stories to be told. And so I would implore journalists, but I would also implore the editors to give them the space. I know I come from the privilege of the New York Times, I understand that. But I think
you didn't just fall into that privilege, just to be clear.
I worked.
People listening here.
You
worked very hard for that. I watched you come up, yeah.
But also, I look at what Ground Up does, and Ground Up does it on very little money. And if you can tell stories, if you can remember, and particularly as we go into election season, to remember that the voting is not about the party, it's not about the president, it is about what people on the ground, the so-called ground, need. So I would just implore people, and that's been our biggest lesson. This hasn't been a big, grand historical narrative or political project or social justice project. It has really been about telling people's stories and having them being seen. And so I hope that I continue to do that in my work, and I hope that if there are journalists listening and editors listening, that we take the news back to the people. That's what I'm hoping.
Lynsey, Tessa, the time has flown by. Thank you so much for this. It's been a privilege to speak to you both. I was a bit nervous about all of this, but you guys made it so easy. Thank you to both of you. You made it so easy. And I wish you every success. For those who haven't seen the book, I'm sure you can find it. Colored.
With all our people's faces on it.
Those are real people, by the by. Those aren't stock photos. Those are the people in the book. Real stories.
These are family members and people that they interviewed, people telling their stories. So these are all historical photos that they got. So that I also love that about the book. Guys, thank you so much for sharing this. Fantastic work, and I wish you all the best. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Cheers.